going live right now. So we are live. Good morning. Hopefully everybody can see us and hear us here. We're coming to you live from a new remote location in Warren County. We're actually at Elliott Brothers Seed here this morning. So appreciate the guys at Elliott Brothers helping us out with the conference room. You'll have to shut the sound off on that, Marie. So I'll introduce my new producer, Marie Rumbold. So Marie is filling in for Adam and Jennifer this morning. So thank you, Marie, for helping us out. She's a little nervous about her first time as producer, and we just had our first new producer hiccup there. So we're going to talk today about a lot of stuff, as we always do. Please chat in your live questions if you have them. So I've got Marie here with me to monitor the live chat. We've got some things that we want to talk about, but as always on Ask the Agronomist, our priority is to talk about what you want to talk about. Hopefully you got a little bit of time to spend with us here this morning. You got your cup of coffee. I've got my Starbucks of the Midwest here with me this morning, so I'm good. And we'll touch on a few things. First thing I want to touch on, just because it's kind of unique and it's kind of weird, and we won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but fall armyworms have actually been a really, really, really big deal, especially if you're a serious alfalfa producer. We've had lots of reports of severe fall armyworm damage in alfalfa across really a pretty big swath of Illinois, probably into other states as well. There have been quite a few acres that needed to be treated for fall armyworm. So keep an eye on your alfalfa. I know we're coming up on, we should be very soon making our last cutting. I don't really like to see alfalfa harvested much after September 10th. Maybe you can push it to the 15th, unless you let it go dormant and then take that late cutting off of it after it's gone dormant. But if you have alfalfa that you're planning to cut yet this year, keep a close eye on that, because the fall armyworm, depending on your cutting schedule. Now my cutting schedule, my fourth cutting is about that tall right now. So I'm going to let it grow a few more days, and I'm going to take a short fourth cutting off of it. I've had so far zero fall armyworm pressure in my alfalfa. Most of the fields that I'm aware of that had bad issues, people were still waiting to make their third cutting. And I think, I might have just gotten lucky, and it may be that based on when I took my third cutting, that field had been recently cut and was not attractive to moths that were laying eggs, which is what turned into the larvae that are causing the issues we're faced with now. Or another way I could have gotten lucky, they may have laid their eggs in my third cutting right before I cut it, and then I bailed up all the eggs and hauled them out of the field, possibly as well. So not exactly sure how my fields escaped fall armyworm, but knock on wood, so far they have. But be on the lookout for that. We have seen a little bit of damage where they're really, really bad in soybeans as well. Tends to be where they've been in a bad alfalfa field, and they've basically eaten that field to the point where they're looking for something else to eat, and they'll move out of the alfalfa field into the adjacent soybean field. We've also had a few situations where a waterway goes up into a bean field, and they've pretty well defoliated that waterway. Soybeans don't appear to be their favored food source, but much like me, when they're hungry, they'll eat about anything. So keep your eye out for fall armyworms. That's just kind of a weird, quirky thing of the 2021 growing season, which has had plenty of weird, quirky things to worry about. So we're probably going to spend most of our time today talking about the corn crop. We have an admitted corn bias here. I got the winged deer behind me up there on the wall. So generally speaking, if you're talking to customers, you're talking to farmers, you're talking to people in Illinois, if you spend time talking about corn, usually they're going to think that's a good use of your time. We've talked, Chris Callowell and I put a video out. You might have seen it. It's been on YouTube for a couple of weeks, talking about the rapid maturation of the corn crop and the rapid decline in health and stalk quality in the corn crop. Those are kind terms. It's just dying, and it's dying hard. It's dying fast. I think most fields are probably going to die a little bit prematurely. Are you dying 3 weeks before black layer or 3 days before black layer? Have you already reached black layer? Have you not? But there's a whole host of reasons why it's occurring. There are lots of factors that make it better or worse in a particular situation. But the point Chris and I have been making increasingly strongly over the last couple of weeks is it's time to be harvesting corn. Each day, there's a few more guys that get out in the field and find out that, guys, this stuff is not in very good shape. I've already got some down corn. It's only September 9th, and I'm already harvesting 20% corn. In some cases, 16% is the driest I've heard. That field was really bad, by the way, so you should not have 16% corn on September 9th, but it's out there. So take home message, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what's going on, why it's so bad, what are the factors, what are the causes, what's the specifics, but the take home message is, we want to start harvest as early as possible. I think you'll be surprised when you get there how dry some of this grain is. So if you're not wanting to start early because you're afraid it's going to be too wet and you're afraid you're going to have a big drying bill, I would argue that might be preferable to picking it up off the ground in November. But I think you may not be pleasantly surprised in the stalk quality. You may not be pleasantly surprised in the yield, but you'll probably be pleasantly surprised it's not as wet as you anticipated it would be based on the calendar date. So I think most people, if you planted corn in April, probably have some corn that it's dry enough to harvest, even if you don't like to harvest high moisture corn. Unfortunately, our April planted corn, there isn't much high moisture April planted corn. So if you're trying to figure out why is a particular field in such bad shape, what's different about this field? So lots of factors going on. We've talked a lot about tar spot, and I'll probably, to some people, be a little off the reservation when I make this statement. Tar spot's not, in my opinion, primarily what's killing the corn. Now, tar spot is a factor. Tar spot is in every field. We've got plenty of tar spot. Tar spot obviously put the plant under a lot more stress. Tar spot was killing leaves, a month ago. Tar spot was taking stay green away from the plant. Tar spot was definitely an added stress. So was southern rust. In some places, there was more southern rust than there was tar spot. Some places there was more tar spot than southern rust. And then there was a band kind of across the middle part of my territory. There was actually a somewhat significant amount of both of those pathogens, both of which have the ability to destroy leaf area late in the season, both of which by themselves have the ability to rob the plant of yield. However, when I go into the really dead fields that are really prematurely dead, the stuff that's been dead for 2 weeks plus, I'm finding crown rot, I'm finding red root rot, I'm finding lots of root health issues. And those crown rot and root rot pathogens, I believe, are primarily a function of the weather that crop went through early in the season, combined with the stress that we were under during grain fill. So crown rot is generally a function of, do you have cold, wet conditions early? And we certainly did, especially if you planted in April. And do we have stress during grain fill? Which we certainly did, because we had really good pollination, we had pretty good ear set, we had really high yield potential. Crown rot tends to be, this is kind of the insidious nature of some of these diseases. Tar spot's a little bit this way too. They thrive in high yield environments. The environment that the pathogen likes is a corn crop that has the potential to be really, really good. And that's one of the frustrating things about these diseases. I mean, we were looking at this crop thinking that there's going to be 260, 280 corn all over the place. And it's still out there. I've had yield reports of 280 plus from guys that are harvesting. There's also been yield reports of sub 200. And the sub 200 is the stuff that's got people really scratching their heads. So there's going to be a lot of acres of really good corn. No matter how good it is, I believe it could have been better if it would have lived longer. Anytime you die prior to black layer, you're losing yield. if you make it to black layer, but you kind of stumble across the finish line, or you're under a tremendous amount of stress leading up to black layer, the first thing you're going to lose before you lose yield is you're going to lose stock quality. And that's probably what's got Cal and I the most spooked, is there's just very, very few acres that, you know, are in good shape from a stock quality standpoint. I've been in fields that were sprayed twice with fungicide that, you know, it's good corn and it's in better shape than the fields that weren't sprayed with fungicide. But considering the fact it was sprayed twice with fungicide, you wouldn't really feel good about how, quote unquote, healthy that crop looks. So healthy is a relative term. The fields that still have some green in them and from the road look relatively good. You know, those fields look good by comparison, but when you get out in them, you'll find out that there's a lot of dead plants in those fields as well. There's a lot of anthracnose starting to show up. There's still a lot of tar spot and southern rust. You can still find crown rot plants. It's not every plant that has crown rot, but there's still a lot of issues going on, even in the healthy fields. The fields that haven't had a green leaf in them in 2 weeks plus, and the ears are all dropped over, and you're starting to see the tops come out of the plants. You're starting to see some plants going over and lodging. Those are the fields that really scare me from a standability standpoint. So I think what Chris and I's message has been is to let's get going. Let's try to prioritize our harvest on the fields that are the deadest and driest first. But if you've got a couple fields that are scaring you, when you get those two out, I wouldn't stop. I'd just keep on rolling, because I think the progression that we're going to see is, and I've had a lot of farmers tell me this, they had some 105-day April planted corn. They were worried about it 2 weeks ago, but their 109-day April planted corn looked great. Well, now they're really worried about the 104 and the 109-day April planted corn and the 111-day, and they're just progressing up through the maturity range. And, you know, I know Cal, his area, you know, a little further along than mine, you know, he's been in 115-day corn that was planted early that's starting to come apart. So you're going to see first the early planted early corn is what's going to go first. The later planted fuller season corn is going to be the healthiest, the longest. But the thing you have to recognize about the later planted full season corn, it hasn't reached black layer yet. So it's not done growing. So if the early planted early corn died 2 weeks prior to black layer, and the late planted late corn ends up dying 2 weeks prior to black layer, there won't be that much difference in the end results. It'll just be, it's going to take a little bit longer for it to get in trouble. The first stuff that's going to get in trouble, sorry, I got a gnat flying around in here this morning. The first stuff that's going to get in trouble is the early planted early corn. Right now, today, the May planted corn appears that, you know, it's staying much healthier, but you have to recognize that corn hasn't black layered yet. It's got a ways to go. It's not done yet. And when it gets to be as mature as the early planted corn, you know, will it still be in better shape? I think it probably will, primarily because it's probably got less crown rot pathogens in it. It probably has healthier roots. It was probably under less stress during grade fill because it had healthier roots. That's the thing with crown rot. You can't really look at the plant in, say, at dough stage or dent stage, early dent, by mid dent, usually you can tell. But in that, you know, R3, R4, up to early R5 stage, that plant looks like it feels pretty good. You can't really see a lot of signs of the stress that it's under. Now, if you dig up the roots and split the crown, you know, you probably could have seen some brown discoloration, early signs of crown rot in that root system 6-8 weeks ago. But until the corn starts looking tough, we usually don't do that. And so a lot of times people miss those early signs. That crown rot infection had been in that plant probably since it was about that tall. And it just lives there in that root system throughout the growing season. It really doesn't look like it's hurting the plant until the plant is trying to finish filling the ear. But it is an additional stress that plant's under. That root system is not real healthy. The root system is not fully functional. The root system's not hitting on all 8 cylinders, so to speak. And so as that plant gets under more and more stress during grain fill, it has a already weakened root system because of the pathogens, because of the diseases, and that just really snowballs on that plant. You've got a plant that's under stress because it can't get enough resources. The resources need to come in through the roots, the water and nutrients that plant needs to survive and thrive. It can't get what it needs. It's already under stress. The more stressed it gets, the sicker the roots get. And at some point, it just dies. And when you see that plant go from green to off green to silver to brown in about a 4 or 5 day period, and you on Monday had a green plant with the ear sticking up, and by Saturday, you've got a brown plant with the ear hanging down, that's crown rot or red root rot or some sort of root health issue that killed the plant from the heart, basically. So, tar spot, southern rust, that's killing your leaves. When you're killing your leaves, that's a stress on the plant. But that plant can survive without its leaves a lot better than it can survive without its roots. So the analogy I use is, let's say something really bad is going to happen to you. Would you rather lose your arm or lose your heart? Tar spot's losing your arm. Crown rot, red root rot's losing your heart. And that's really what's happened to a lot of these fields that have just died like that. If you're looking at a field, trying to determine, what is it about this field that's making it so bad, look at planting date first. So far from what I've seen, probably the biggest variable in how bad is it is when was it planted. The earlier, generally speaking, there's exceptions to every rule. Generally speaking, the earlier it was planted, the worse it is. Now, that doesn't mean that all early planted corn is going to be bad, but generally speaking, the longer you laid in a cold, wet soil, and the more times you got wet and soaked and saturated and chilled, the more likely that seedling was to get infected with a root and crown rot pathogen, which set it up for the problems that they're experiencing later in the growing season. The second thing I would say that's a driver is, what's the soil type? So is it a heavy, high organic matter, flat, black, poorly drained soil? If it is, that's the environment that those pathogens really thrive in. Those are the soils that more often have the right environment for the pathogen to be very virulent and do a lot of infecting. I would say probably the third factor would be, did the field get fungicide or not? Most of the worst fields that I have been in did not receive a fungicide application. Now, we sprayed more fungicide this year than we probably ever have. I've heard people say they think we sprayed 2 or 3 times as much as normal. But even if we sprayed 2 or 3 times as much as normal, that means probably a fourth to a third of the corn crop did not get fungicide. And in some areas, it's probably a higher percentage than that. So I think that's the third factor that we're seeing. Fourth factor would be, what's the maturity of the hybrid? So is it 105 day or is it 115 day? The 115 day today looks a hell of a lot better than the 105 day. Now, as we've already discussed, the 115 today, if you planted in Warren County, if you plant 115 day corn in, the third week of April, it probably has not reached a natural black layer yet. So it needs to still be green, or that means it's dying prematurely as well. So by the time that crop is as mature as the 105 day is, I don't know how much better it's going to look, to be quite honest with you. But at any given point in time, the fuller season corn generally is going to appear to be healthier. Other factors that are involved is, we all had more rain than we needed at certain times of the year. So, places that were really dry early, I'm seeing a bit of a trend where the crop is hanging in there healthier. So that's kind of like having a well-drained soil versus a wet soil. So if you were in a place that had 3 or 4 inches of rain in May versus 8 inches of rain in May, 3 or 4 is better than 8. If you were extremely dry early to the point where you were concerned about drought, that's probably helping you now, because, being dry early is actually better than being too wet early. And the places that had a lot of rain, a lot of excess rain, a lot of heavy rain, a lot of big rain events, I think we're seeing a trend where that environment is probably playing a role. In addition to when were we too wet, there are also people, and on my farm at home, we only had 1 8 inches in July. If you had a dry July and a dry early August, that's a factor in this as well. Those plants were under quite a bit of stress at that time, trying to fill that ear, trying to fill those kernels. And if you got a little dry during grain fill, and even if you weren't super dry, if you think about it, if you've got a root system that's not operating at peak efficiency, even a little bit of dryness is probably enough to put that plant under a lot of stress. We've also had periods where we had a lot of hot nights. And even if it was only, 92 during the day is not particularly stressful for corn. 92 with a 94% humidity and 110 heat index is really stressful on old fat agronomists, but not particularly for corn. But 84-degree nights, when you're watching the news at 10 o'clock to catch the weather before you go to bed, and it's still 82 degrees, that's a pretty stressful night for a corn plant. We had quite a few of those. Another stress that we had during grain fill that I'm not sure everybody has thought about, we've talked a fair amount about this, but our light quality was horrible this summer. We had so many days early in the growing season that were low light because of cloud cover, because of rain events. Then we had a lot of hazy, humid days, and then we had the foggy, smoggy, somebody's smoke from somebody's wildfire up in the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun. And it was just a pretty low light summer. That's a factor in why tar spot's so bad. I think that's a factor in why stalk quality is so bad. It's probably a factor in why some of these pathogens are as bad as they are. And then you throw on top of that, all the foliar disease pressure we had pretty heavy southern rust. We had the most tar spot we've ever seen. Tar spot obviously is a pathogen that's extremely aggressive. Corn as a host plant has a very low level of resistance to tar spot. And so, you're really relying exclusively on fungicides to protect you from tar spot, because there really isn't a lot of resistance in corn to help you. And so just a lot of factors kind of going into what's driving things. And I think people get really frustrated, and I empathize that, it seems like sometimes everything you do to give that corn crop the ability to yield 300 bushel is just making some of these issues that sometimes arise, seem like they're worse. And I know, this is a dangerous thing for a seed guy to say, because it sounds like we're making excuses for dead corn. But the reality is the more your corn crop was going to yield, the more stress it was under when things started to go backwards, on that crop in August. So if you had a field that was going to make 220, it was not under as much stress as a field that was going to make 280. So we don't necessarily want to, lower our sights on yield goals, but when we push this crop to do what it can do, and that's 280 plus, field averages, that's what our aggressive producers are going for. That is creating a situation where, that plant was under a lot of stress. If you've noticed walking fields, not much tip back out there. So we had really good pollination. We had pretty low stress after pollination. That ear those kernels cannot abort after about R3. So if they make it to the roasting ear stage without tip back, that ear is pretty well stuck with all those kernels. So it can't abort kernels after R3. So when it's after R3, the only way it can lighten the load is just to make those kernels smaller, make them shallower, not make them as deep. And if the plant could have aborted kernels, it would have sacrificed some kernels off the ear. that would have lightened the load on the plant, and that plant would be healthier today. I've seen in a few fields, if you get into an area with a poor stand, and your stand's down to 24,000, those plants are a lot healthier there than when you've got a good stand of 35,000. We were in a plot last week and noticed in a thin area, one particular hybrid had set 2 ears on most of the plants in that thin area. Every plant with 2 ears was dead. The plants with 1 ear were alive. If you're looking at a field that you see a few scattered plants that are still green, a lot of times those plants don't have much of an ear on them, and those plants have less of an ear on them because they were maybe behind early. They were actually the worst plants in the field early in the season, so they've got a smaller ear. The fact that they've got a smaller ear, they weren't working as hard during grain fill, and so they're the healthiest plants in the field today in some cases. So it all relates back to how much stress was that plant under. What did you do, either on purpose or by accident, to either increase or decrease the amount of stress it was under, and how much root rot infection is in the root system based on soil type, planting date, weather patterns, some of those other factors. One thing that's a little bit of a variable to watch for, if you did any in-furrow treatments with starter, either with a fungicide or with some sort of biological product, there's a lot of things that have the ability to impact that crop. So if you've done any trial work with any anything that's a little bit unique like that, I'd get out there and I'd look at those treated strips or those split fields and see if you can see a difference. If you did a V5, V6 fungicide, that has been shown to reduce the incidence and severity of crown rot. I've had a couple guys send me some satellite imagery photos of fields that there's a huge difference in the field between did it get early fungicide, and when I say early, I'm talking V5, V6 timing, like with a herbicide. Did you get a fungicide application then? And then, did it get fungicide at tassel time? Was it before tassel, at tassel, green silk, brown silk, R3? When did that fungicide go on? What product did you use? What rate did you use? There's just a ton of variables that go into that. We're getting reports that guys are seeing a lot of streaking in fields that were treated with fungicide. Which probably goes back to there's a big rate effect of fungicides on tar spot. So prior to tar spot, we didn't really have to worry too much about how uniform is that application across the field, and how good a coverage are we getting on that application across the field. We just needed to get it out there, get it on the plant. If you got it on the plant, in the case of the strobies, you get it in the plant, you get the plant health benefits, you get the stress relieving properties of the strobies. Well, with tar spot, things are a little different. We've got a disease that we actually need to control. And to control that disease, you have to get the right rate, on the plant, and you have to do a good job getting it down into the canopy. And my guess is just the way those wind currents are swirling around out there when we're making those applications, are you getting 150% rate here, 100% rate here, a 75% rate over here? And, the average of the field is the, 100% rate that you were shooting for. But we definitely see a huge difference in tar spot control specifically based on rate. So if you're getting a heavy rate here and a light rate there, you may see a surprising difference in greenness late in the season due to the differences in rates. If you happen to use the maximum label rate of a fungicide, you're probably going to see a lot better control out of that higher rate. If you happen to use a full rate in your V5 application instead of a half rate, which is more standard, might be an advantage to that. I just talked to a producer today. He had a field that got some overspray on it. So when the neighbor sprayed his corn, 12 days later, it got a double shot of fungicide 12 days apart. According to the yield monitor, there was a 40-plus bushel difference in the strip that they think got oversprayed. Now, maybe there was some other variable in there as well that was driving that. But you're going to see a lot of weird stuff this fall. you're going to be in some 300 bushel corn in a field, and it's going to drop to 140 somewhere in the field. And what's the difference between the 300 and the 140? Is it soil type? Is it water? Is it disease? Is it some sort of application variable? In some cases, it will be almost impossible to determine for sure is what's driving that difference. But we're going to see, seems like every year we talk about, we'll see huge differences in yield going through the field. We'll see huge differences in yield between fields. We will see huge differences in yield in hybrids. One other factor that, it is going to be a factor in performance is obviously hybrid. And I didn't mention that on my original list of what's driving differences. Hybrids always matter. Hybrid differences always occur. The fact that makes me think that hybrid is not, hybrid's probably not on my top 5 list of what's making a difference in some of these fields, because I have different people, either cursing or bragging about the same hybrids. So what one guy is branding as his worst, another guy I talked to said, well, it looks like that's one of my best. And this other hybrid is my issue. And I think by the end of the growing season, I'll probably have somebody that's upset at every hybrid that's out there, because in some cases, based on when it was planted, the soil type, the management, what Mother Nature threw at it, I'm not sure it's going to make as much difference as you might think what hybrid was planted in that field. The deck was so stacked against some of these fields, it's going to be really, really difficult for whatever is in that particular environment to meet your expectations. So I've been talking for a long time here. I haven't paused to ask Marie if anybody has chatted in a question or if we've had any questions come in via phone or internet. But always do encourage you to ask questions. I think that's what makes this format fun for me, and I think it makes it more entertaining for you if we can get some live questions. But Marie, I'll just pause there. Has anything came in, or have you gotten any questions from growers in the last few days that you talked to that you think we ought to talk about?
I think a good one probably a question that came in, a good one to hit on would be, would corn that dies prematurely dry down slower in the field?
Yes. So that is I would say a common, I'll call it a misperception. And the reason I say it's a misperception is you've probably heard, you probably felt, you've probably been told that if corn dies prematurely, it doesn't dry down properly. That's not an inaccurate statement, but the reality is when corn dies prematurely, when early planted corn dies prematurely in central Illinois, that usually means it died in August. And it's really hot in August, and it's really hot in early September. And when dead corn is standing out in the field and it's 88 degrees and the wind's blowing and it's sunny, it dries really fast. So in my experience, I can't recall a situation where a guy goes from green corn that's making 280, and as you're traveling along in the combine, you hit the dead spot that's making 160, and you want to know, where in the hell did my other 120 bushel of corn go? It's usually 4 or 5 points drier where it's dead than it is where it's green in the field. Where I think you can get into dry down challenges with corn that dies prematurely is if it's late planted corn that gets froze off by an early freeze in October or a normal freeze in November. And at that time of the year, you've got a really wet kernel because it died prematurely. If it wasn't black layered yet, it was probably 40% moisture, and it's cold. And it's late and it's cloudy and we don't have the heat units. We don't have the sunlight. The environment's not as good for field drying conditions. So if your corn dies early, it's probably going to be drier than normal. If your corn died prematurely late in the season, that's where we might run into some dry down issues where it seems like it's just not drying in the field. But, in my experience, if it dies early, And dying early means it died in August. That stuff's going to be drier than it should be, not wetter than it should be.
Another question, I know we spent a lot of time talking about corn, just kind of a general state of the union on soybeans, or are some of these late rains positively impacting soybean yields, and how do beans look in general in the area?
Yeah, so good question. And I've probably been being kind of hard on beans through the growing season. I was really nervous that soybeans were going to be disappointing relative to what we've experienced the last 2 seasons. I actually have not heard a bean yield yet. There have been some early Group 2s planted early in the central part of the state that have been harvested. So I think there's probably some rumors of bean yields floating around out there. I just haven't heard them yet. I am concerned that beans, while they look beautiful today, they're pretty green, they're pretty healthy. We're seeing a little bit of sudden death. We're seeing a little bit of white mold. There's a little bit of natural maturity going on, especially if you planted something early, an early maturing bean early. The bean crop looks pretty green and healthy and fabulous right now, especially compared to what we're looking at in cornfields. I will say that I have not been overly excited with the pod count that I've been getting in a lot of bean fields. So I'm finding lots of nodes that only have 1 or 2 or 3 pods. I'm not finding as many 4 bean pods up and down the plant as I would like to. In some cases, I've got a nice cluster at the top that hopefully it will fill well. But if your beans are still green and you've had good moisture, you're still adding yield to those beans. And I'm thankful that most of the beans are green, because that means they're taking advantage of. We've really had pretty good growing conditions here as of late. We've kept getting moisture. We've got good moisture. Sunlight conditions have improved. We've actually had more bright sunny days as of late. And so we can still be adding some yield into those fields that are still green. Now, if they're starting to turn, that's the equivalent of physiological maturity in corn. So it's like black layer in corn. If those beans have started to turn, they have accumulated all the dry matter that they're going to accumulate in the grain. And at that point, they're just drying down. But I'm thankful for the fact that most fields of beans I drive past are still green. That means they're more than a month away from being ready to cut. And that gives us a good solid month to do nothing but harvest corn. So I think you're going to have to make some decisions, and make some hard decisions, unfortunately, this fall with how you prioritize your harvest. I was talking to a friend of mine last night that I told him, I said, this might be one of those years where the beans are just going to have to wait, because the risk of the corn going down is just more than we can stand. And he reminded me, he says, well, you say that, but do you remember 2 years ago when both you and I were trying to cut beans in November and we had snow on the ground? That was not a fun experience. Hopefully we don't have any November snows, because I think a lot of guys are probably going to give harvest priority to corn. And I think that's probably the right decision to make. And hopefully the beans will hang in there and wait for us, and we don't end up, losing the weather and trying to cut beans when it's raining and snowing in November, or cut a bunch of 8% beans because it just never rains through harvest. And once they get dry, we never get moisture back into that grain. So I think as you're trying to prioritize harvest, I think my first recommendation would be get out in your fields and see what you got. So if you have not been in your cornfields for a couple of weeks, brace yourself for what it's going to look like when you go back, because it has changed radically in the last 2 weeks. So the way you can evaluate stalk quality in corn, there's 3 simple tests. So if you're walking through a field that's standing, obviously if it's already down, you know quality's not good. But let's say the crop's standing perfectly. So you can do three tests, and any one of them will work. You don't have to do all 3 of them. So we got the kick test, the push test, and the pinch test. So it depends on, depends on what you prefer. The push test, if you can lean a stalk over to where the tassel on the stalk you're leaning touches the tassel on the stalk on the next row, and let go, and it comes back to you, that's really good. That probably won't happen in a lot of cases, but if it does, that's really good. The other thing you can do is called a pinch test. The problem with the pinch test is it requires you to bend over and get your fingers down to the bottom of the stalk. And if you can pinch that lower stalk and just squeeze it between your fingers without using superhuman strength, that's an indication that that stalk is pretty heavily cannibalized, and stalk quality, even if it's standing, is pretty weak. The other thing you can do is what we call a kick test. So if you just take the toe of your boot, grab the stalk in front of you, kick the base of the plant with the toe of your boot. If it's a rotten stalk or a crown rot infected plant, you'll just smoke that thing off right at the soil surface. You don't have to rear back and give it a big old mule kick. Just kick it with the toe of your boot, and if that's a infected plant, that plant's you're gonna break it off right at the soil surface. You're gonna have a plant. You're gonna be holding it in your hand. It's not gonna be attached to the surface of the soil any longer. So those are the 3 ways to evaluate stalk quality. I would do that in every field as best you can. I would start with your early planted corn first. And that's probably if you want to prioritize harvest based on stalk quality, based on the potential for lodging, based on the risk of letting it go, and probably also based on the harvest moisture, because in most cases, the deader it is, the drier it's going to be. It's not always the case, but generally speaking, that's true. So that's how I would evaluate stalk quality if you're trying to prioritize where you want to start your harvest. I would say start as soon as you can. If that was 2 days ago, great. If that's today, great. If that's tomorrow, great. If that's next week, good enough. Whenever you can get started, get started. And my guess is once you get started, you probably won't stop, because you'll get that worst field done. And then the field that was the second worst, might look, by the time you get the first one done, the second one might look about like the first one did when you did it. And I think we'll have to go really fast to keep up with, how quickly the crop is declining. If you can harvest fast enough to, gain up on that, decline as we go through the harvest season, that's great. Most of us probably can't get the crop out that fast. So I would say get started, get going, keep rolling, and hopefully we don't have too many breakdowns, delays, and knock on wood. Hopefully no severe storms. I know some of our colleagues in the more east central part of the state had a bad storm event a couple nights ago, and it just makes me shiver to think about what this crop would look like if we had a heavy storm event roll through where you've got, heavy rain and 50, 60, 70 mile an hour winds blowing on stuff. That would be a sad sight to behold. And those of you who have already had that know what I'm talking about. But most of those events for us were 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they were devastating. They would be more devastating today than they were 2 or 3 weeks ago, because there's just more stuff that's not in good shape from a stalk quality standpoint. So, Marie, anything else on your list or on your mind?
I think you hit them, and you hit the soybean one, and oops.
Yep. Come on in, Roger. We've got to we're live on the air on Ask the Agronomist here. So you can come in, set in with me if you want. So I don't think he is, actually. I'm not sure. He's hiding because he didn't want to be on Ask the Agronomist either. So
I don't want to interrupt.
thank you. So just had a good customer stop by here while we were on Ask the Agronomist. So that's one of the dangers of being live on remote location. But so anyway, I think we can probably go ahead and maybe end a little bit early, which is something I don't typically do. But we haven't gotten a lot of questions, a lot more questions coming in this morning. So just to remind you, these videos are all posted on our YouTube channel. So if you like to watch them not live, but after the fact, they will be there. If you have a question that you didn't have the opportunity to ask here on the broadcast, please send it to your FSR, send it to me, email it to me, text it to me, text it to your FSR. Get those questions to us. We do this every 2 weeks. We're going to try to keep that going. Would love to have more live participation in the videos, because I think that's what makes it fun, what makes it interesting. I love interacting with an audience. I would much rather do this live in person, but with this medium, we can reach a lot more people a lot quickly. If you have suggestions for ways you think we can improve what we're doing here, topics that we ought to cover, please send those in. The next episode will be 2 weeks from today, which will be, I believe, September 23rd. So put that on your calendar. If you want to sign up on our YouTube channel, you can get reminders emailed or text to you for Ask the Agronomist. I know a lot of our FSRs try to send out reminders for when these broadcasts are coming up as well. So with that, everybody, please be safe through harvest. I think it'll be I think we'll see lots of interesting things this harvest. Some of the interesting things will be exciting. Some of the interesting things will be disappointing. But first and foremost, we want all of you to be safe and everybody get back home to their family at the end of each long harvest day. So keep that first and foremost in your mind, and everybody be well, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thanks.
I added the soybean one. That was me. You had kind of covered all of them. I